I'm Matt Wilhelmi, and I am the owner of Strategic Voyages Business Consultants, and I'm also the author of Taboo Business Questions. And today, I'm really excited. I am joined by Jim Voigt, who is the small business attorney helping businesses launch, grow, and exit. Hi, Jim. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing real well. Jim's been a licensed attorney for over 17 years. And before that, he's actually owned businesses for 15 years, which gives him a much, much different perspective on helping small businesses.
It does. And it makes me old.
And it makes it old. So today, one of the things that we're going to be diving into, Jim, is this topic of succession planning. And it's a topic that comes up in my world from the finance perspective, helping companies with their finances as their CFO, because a lot of times business owners want to know, what is my business worth? They want to know, well, what happens if something happens to me? Or they want to know how to get this business to be run by somebody else. And that, brings us to this topic of succession planning. I'm really excited to spend some time with you. I know you've helped quite a few businesses in the succession planning world.
Yes. Yeah. It's a great way. I mean, it's one of the things I really enjoy the most about my practice, because, you're helping somebody create the retirement that they really wanted, hopefully, with the right planning and that sort of a thing. It can be one of the things you do in a person's life that has the biggest impact on their lives.
Absolutely. I've seen money lost. I've seen money gained. I've seen money frivolously spent. When it comes to succession planning, you really have to set up that next generation for success. And generation, I don't necessarily just mean, familial generations, but right. We'll dive into that a little bit more today. When you and I were kind of talking about how we're going to attack this topic of succession planning, we were going back and forth a little bit about a specific company, because you've got, I would imagine, dozens of stories. I've got dozens of stories. And so instead of trying to pull from all of these different stories, we thought, hey, let's choose one example that maybe a lot of people can relate to. And so I'll just set the stage a little bit. And then we'll talk about some cautionary tales. We'll go into maybe some advice that you can give some of these small business owners. But to set the stage today in the topic of succession planning, I'm really looking forward to it, because we're going to dive in and talk about a family business. This is a mom and dad that are running the business. They've got their really, really bright son kind of coming up in the professional ranks, and they're running into some issues. They're not maybe doing everything super perfect, but they're running into different issues with who's going to do what. They're running into issues with delegation and different personalities, and how do you kind of separate maybe business disagreements and then enjoy family time together? I mean, all of that, right? That all comes into succession planning.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And there's that when you add the element of a family involved in a business, you say the son is coming up through the business, it is almost certain that this, we'll call it the selling generation, whether it's a sale or not, that the generation that is transitioning out and the generation that is transitioning in have wildly different assumptions about how that's going to go. The other thing that's shocking is it's extremely rare for either side of that equation to talk about it ever. So
yeah, I would imagine there's also different motivations too, right? Yeah. They're not motivated by the same thing.
There are times that it's great. You've got the second generation coming up through, and like you said earlier, that might be kids coming up through the company. It might just be your mid-level managers that are making their way, rising to the top and into leadership positions. But you've got the second generation coming through. They understand that the generation above them is going to be moving out at some point in time, and they're anxious to sort of put their own signature on how this business is run once they take over. That is utopia. And as you and I know, Matt, in the consulting business, utopia is kind of rare. So what you and I do, our role is to try to facilitate that as much as we can, try to create that utopia. And it almost always comes down to a simple fact of getting folks talking to each other about this. It's a topic that people almost invariably like to avoid. People don't like talking about money between, close relationships, whether it's a key employee or especially a child moving up through the company. It's hard for them.
Yeah, Jim, one of the things that I find interesting about doing the succession planning work is almost this inability to mentally get to a place where it's comfortable and okay to have disagreements, to have priorities heard, to kind of manage some of the feelings. Because the numbers are what the numbers are. It's really tough to argue about that. But when you start talking about priorities and motivations and utopia, you're going to go in a lot of different directions. When you and I were really getting together about this topic of succession planning, there were 4 things that you said that you wanted to go over and really kind of make sure that we touched on to set the stage for succession planning. Can you go through those real quick?
Yeah, it's 4 questions really. So the first question is, when do you want to transition? Hopefully the answer isn't next month. Right. So when do you want to transition? And the earlier we have that conversation, the better. What do you want financially? And this is what's surprising to most people that work in the succession business is often getting paid for the business. I mean, people aren't dumb. They want to get paid for their business, but it is often isn't even their top 5 considerations. They start rattling things off. Like, I want to make sure that my vendors are taken care of, my customers, blah, blah, blah. So the third question is, how many people are involved here? Is this a husband and wife that own the company? Are there, other family members? Do maybe some employees have smaller amounts of stock? How many people are involved? And the fourth question is, who needs to know about this and when? That's a tough one, but it's basically when to do this. What do you want financially out of it? How many people are involved today? And who needs to know about this transition and when?
Yeah, those are 4 really, really good questions to start with. And it reminds me of kind of a pillar of this conversation, which is there's no one size fits all answer. Anybody who tells you that every succession plan works out exactly the same way has never done a succession plan. Right. There's maybe some online resources to get the conversation started. Business valuation tools and how do I figure out my EBITDA and some of those things. But when you really get into it and when you really talk to the people who are making some of these decisions and whose lives it's going to impact, this conversation goes a number of different directions. And so I'm going to start with the first one you said. So when do you want this thing to happen, right? I think you and I would probably prefer a little bit more time than less, right? But not too long. I don't think 20, like if we're talking about 20 years, it's almost like, all right, well, call me back when you're a little bit more serious.
Yeah, there is there is a transition that does require 20 years. And there's this system by which you'll trickle down very small pieces of stock to key employees over the course of a long period of time. That's your 20-year. That's exceptionally rare in small businesses. But you're right. That's the only time. If you're planning that far ahead, unless you're doing this literally 1 or 2% to 3 or 4 employees every year over the course of 20 years, 20 years is way too long.
So if we were to kind of maybe get closer to like an ideal timeline, I think just people think about 5 years, just because talking heads say that, if you Google it, I'm sure that's probably one of the top results, but 5 years feels about right. What are maybe 2 or 3 of the key things that during those 5 years should happen? What, like knowledge transfer, maybe financial, building up of the financial resources in the company? What are some of the things that people need to do while they're in this process of talking about it?
Yeah. So the number one thing that you want to do is get your financials cleaned up, and that doesn't necessarily mean everybody interprets that as, okay, make sure you're super profitable. I would love for you to be super profitable. It's always easier to sell a business if it's profitable. But what I mean is, a lot of times we're not super fastidious about how we maintain our bookkeeping. You're like, we'll categorize this as this and that, whatever. We know we're making money, but no, you want to get to a point where you're maybe bringing in an outside bookkeeper if you don't have one already, or hiring a bookkeeper, somebody, so that your books are very accurate and easily digestible for somebody that's reviewing them, right? It's always one of those where you look at your books and you're like, yeah, okay, that's basically what it says our profit is, but I know about this other. You can't have any of that, this sort of stuff that's in your head. Your financials need to be a clear explanation of what's happening in your business. So clean up your financials, get them nice and clean. 2 is make sure that your taxes are squeaky clean. You're going to be looking back for 3 years. 3 tax returns are typical for what's going to be reviewed during a business sale. So you want to, file those taxes on time. If you can avoid extending, you should. But you want 3 timely filed, nice, clean tax returns that are not going to need to be amended later. So the reason we like to start 5 years out instead of 3 is because, being perfectly blunt, it sometimes takes you a couple of years to sort of get things financially working like a well-oiled machine so that you have 3 years of clean tax returns. It is, for people who aren't in business, it is shockingly possible to run like sort of off the cuff financially without having super squeaky clean financials, believe it or not. Then the other is going to be, and you talked about knowledge transfer. During that first year of those 5 years, we want to figure out one of two things: either who are we going to transition this to if it's somebody internal, or if we're going to sell it to somebody external, who are they going to have on board to make that transition successful? And sometimes the answer is nobody, and that's okay, but we want to at least know that. And one of the things we can start to do is, if there are key employees that we want to make sure are around because they'll make the company more valuable, we can start looking at locking those employees in with a good employment agreement that benefits both sides.
Are those called the golden handcuffs I've heard about?
It could be. I mean, the golden handcuffs tend to have, they're more related to larger companies that can pay out giant bonuses and all of that stuff. At the level we're talking about, where it's a husband and wife running a business, even if it's a really successful business, it's not typically the golden handcuffs. But what we like to see is, I personally, I'm not a huge fan of locking people into a job with a non-compete. Especially in Illinois, which is where we're recording this, they're so hard to enforce anyway. I would love for people to be staying long-term in your business because it's well run and they're well cared for, as opposed to just there's this sheet of paper that everyone hates that says they can't leave. But yeah, I mean, a non-compete can be helpful. The employment agreement, the nice thing about it is, very often a small business owner has the intent of taking really good care of their employees, but they are famous for just keeping all that in their head. So if we can start to set expectations. The other thing that you're doing too, though, is if you have people locked in, like key employees that are doing well, locked in with an employment agreement, you're going to greatly increase you may not increase the price that you get for your business, but you will make the prospect of finding somebody who will buy your business, you open it up to a much wider pool of potential buyers, because you don't need to only sell to somebody who is also really good at operating your type of business. And the employment agreements are just, evidence during the due diligence process that you've done this correctly, that you've taken the right steps.
So, Jim, I think it's obvious that you've got a wealth of knowledge here, and I'm really excited for this time that you're able to kind of open up the knowledge vault here and share some of this. We're going to talk about a really specific example. This is a husband and wife company that has, their son has been working in the company for about 5 years. He knows all of these vendors. He's very intimately aware of what's going on in the business from the operational side. And one of the struggles that we might get into is some of the things maybe he doesn't know about the business. Because just because you work in the family business, you might pick up a little things from conversations here and there, but there's a lot more to running a business than that. And I think that might be, one of the issues that a company runs into when they're talking about succession planning. So I'm really excited about our next episode. We'll go into some more detail about some cautionary tales, and we'll get into some maybe stories that you could share with things that you've seen, and maybe deals going sideways, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then, in the last episode, Jim, I'm really looking forward to hearing the straightforward, no BS advice. What are the 2 or 3 really key pieces of advice that we need to be thinking about when we're talking about succession planning for this company? Stay tuned.